Shabbat Shalom and an early Chag Sameach. Yeah, now early Chag, that's even harder to get off the tongue. So you'd be forgiven if you thought there was an authoritarian strain in Judaism. I mean, after all, here we have Moses. Moses is the leader appointed by God, not by the people, and subject apparently to a life term, which from the moment he takes over office in the people of Israel as leader, extends for 40 years. It's a long time to be in charge. And then he appoints his brother, Aaron, to be the hereditary priest, so that the Kohanim are the priests until this day. We still have some of the Kohanim in this very room. And then, of course, we have later on kings appointed. That becomes the Davidic dynasty. So you might think that democracy is a little bit of a foreign concept to Israel. Not so. Not so. Because we hear not only that Aaron is going to be a Kohen, but who else is appointed as a Kohen? All of us. We are called to be a nation of Kohanim. Now, it's true that oftentimes the translation will translate for Aaron a Kohen and for the rest of us priests. He may get a capital P, the rest of us get a lowercase p, but no such distinction exists within the Hebrew. Yes, there are certain rights, responsibilities, prerogatives that go to being a Kohen of the Aaron clan, but God is clearly trying to say that Judaism is not for the priestly class alone, that Judaism is for the rank and file, and indeed the rank and file have had a huge impact on how Judaism is practiced and developed over the centuries. Throughout our history, the rights and rules of the leaders, which could sometimes at the top of the pyramid appear to be rather authoritarian, whether they be a king or a priest, were constantly being influenced, curtailed, and revolted against by the rest of us. During the days of King David, who was in charge of your everyday life? Not King David. King David was in charge of the country. King David sat in Jerusalem, or at least for much of his reign. King David was in charge if there was a war. King David was in charge of some building projects. His son did a lot more. King David was sort of, the national leader. But if you were in a village and you wanted to buy land from the guy next door, and the guy next door agreed and you made a deal, but then you said he reneged and he said you reneged, King David didn't hear about that, generally speaking. That would be handled by the village elders. And who made the village elders the village elders? And don't just say their birthdays. By popular acclaim. Right? The people of the village basically knew who was a good person, who was trustworthy, who was more or less sensible, and those would be the people that people would turn to, and they would meet and they would gather, oftentimes described as being in the city gates, and if you had a claim, you would go to them, discuss it, and it would be resolved. We see this most explicitly in the story of Ruth, where there was an issue of the redemption of the land that belongs to Naomi's family, and Ruth as well, and they go to the city gates, and that's where they're hanging out to handle these sorts of things. No one goes off to find the shofet of the time, since this was during the days of the judges. You go to your local council. No problem. Judaism loves democracy. But this is a double-edged sword. Because as anybody who has ever had a leadership position in a Jewish organization can tell you, every Jew absolutely thinks of themselves as being the high priest, as being the king. It has often been referred to as herding cats. No one is exactly going to take second fiddle to someone else. And so it can be sometimes more democracy than you ever imagined when trying to work in a Jewish organization. Generally speaking, 2,000 years after the destruction of the most strong power symbols of Judaism, the Sanhedrin, the Kohanim, etc., as in Jerusalem, apparently this has actually worked out okay for us. Yes, it can be challenging, occasionally even frustrating, occasionally tearing out hair. That's not how I'm losing mine, I promise. Temple Israel is much better than most congregations I've worked with. But it apparently works. It actually has sustained us for 2,000 years and still going strong. So we should not be alarmed at the fourth election in Israel in 2 years. That may seem like a lot more democracy than most people would like, that a lot more instability than most people would like. I get that. I understand that, and it's not only because I was a political science major that I am still hopeful for Israel, but because I believe this is not something entirely surprising given the way Israel has established its democracy. Taking our tradition to heart, Israel tried to make sure when it put together its Knesset, its parliamentary system, that there could be as much representation of the diverse views as possible. Think about the Jews who came to Israel prior to 1948 and since its establishment. They came from all over the globe, from different cultures, from different languages, from different backgrounds, from different religious degrees of observance, stringencies, leniencies, or indeed complete secular identities. Do you believe that Israel should have a political system which only reflects two of those identities? No. It would simply be unimaginable. It would be impossible to imagine that in the short time that Israel has existed, that all of that great chaos of Jewish vitality should have been distilled into 2 or 3 mundane, easily categorized, and stable political identities. Because that's not the way Jews work. And indeed, if you are a political watcher, it can be a lot of fun to watch Israel, because those identities and affiliations continue to shift and move in every election, and sometimes even during the election. There was a new challenger party called Tzav under Tzav that was being put forward this election. A month ago, they were going to get 20 seats according to the polls, which is a large portion of the 120 in the Knesset. Anybody know how many they actually got? 9. What happened? What happened was the public changed their mind. The Israelis do not have the same sense of born a Democrat, die a Democrat, born a Republican, die a Republican. They said, you know what, he makes a lot of good points. Yeah, I'd vote for him if the election were today. If the election for a month from now, I might have a different opinion. And they did. So what has kept Israel from having a Knesset that actually serves out a few years at a time, as in the old days? What is the major issue that is keeping a coalition from being formed even at this moment? The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. It is rather unusual that for a group of people that are so bent on democracy and representation and all of our participation, and all of the different vibrant dialogue of issues and topics that Israel has, this last election essentially came down to one person. This is rather an aberration in Israeli history, at least within modern Israeli history, that there would be an election that was being decided not over major security issues, not over major economic issues, not over major social issues, but over who would get to be prime minister. And it wasn't between one guy and another guy, or gal. After all, Israel has had a female prime minister. It was over one guy and not that guy. That is how the politics have broken down, quite literally, over this last election. So there are 52 members of the new Knesset that are adamantly on the side of Netanyahu as the next prime minister. You need 60 in order to actually get a majority of the Knesset. And on the opposite side of people who are adamantly opposed under no circumstances, they don't care who else it might be, it can't be Netanyahu, there are 57. 52 versus 57. It's a bit of an issue. And there are, as you can do the math, a few in between that have not yet stated definitely him or definitely not him. One is a very right-wing party that has leaned in the direction of many of Netanyahu's policies on some issues, not on some others. And the other is a splinter Arab party that broke away from what was called the Joint List, well, still is called the Joint List, which is more of a unified party that represents the Arab-Israeli interests. Those two are very unlikely to serve together. That is to say, the right-wing party and the Arab party are not exactly natural bedfellows. And so Netanyahu's coalition would need both of them to join his side in order to have his majority and be able to be prime minister for an additional term. On the other hand, the other side also is unlikely to be able to pull in either of those two parties, because were they to do so, they would lose some of the other members of smaller parties that are making up that anti-Netanyahu coalition at the moment. Which means, at the moment, the most likely outcome is another election. If you haven't decided yet, then we have to go back and vote again, and there will be a new outcome, and hopefully this time there will be a clearer majority within the coalitions that build. Now, there are other options. What were we thinking when we did it? Well, there are other options. There is the option that perhaps one side or the other can convince members of the other parties to jump ship. The same way that in the United States, a member of the Senate or the House of Representatives could wake up one morning and say, you know what, I am no longer going to be from party X, I'm going to be from party Y, and they keep their seat, they keep their place, they just change where they're sitting in the aisle. So too, that could happen now that there's been an election. The members of the new Knesset could cross sides, either going against Netanyahu or going towards him, and a coalition could be formed that will actually allow another government to be made. On the other hand, the other option would be to pass legislation that says Netanyahu can't be prime minister again. Remove him from the table, and therefore allow all the other parties to renegotiate their agreements with him no longer as a stumbling block, no longer as the blockage clogging the artery, if you will. Now, you might say it sounds a little undemocratic to say one person can no longer be prime minister. However, the legislation that's being put forward doesn't name him by name. It simply innocuously says anybody who is currently under indictment by the government for, crime cannot be prime minister. And as it just so happens, despite many of his machinations, Netanyahu is still under indictment for numerous counts of corruption and other violations of the trust of the public. So it just would occur that he would be stricken off as one of the options. There are a number of other politicians as well who would not be able to be prime minister, but it's a whole other concept of how Israel handles its internal corruption issues. A third option would be to take legislation in the short term, which would say, we're going to raise the threshold of who can get into the Knesset. Right now, I believe the number, because it keeps changing, is about 4.5% of the vote will allow you to be part of the dividing pie of the 120 seats. There is talk of raising that up, make it 10%, 15%, 20%. So therefore, these small parties that have only 4, 5, 6 seats will not be able to wrangle for power to hold up coalition building over their singular issues that they are trying to support. Instead, the coalitions will need to be made before the election rather than after the election. Congregating the votes, which, as I said at the beginning, is hard to imagine in Israel, of people who come from diverse backgrounds, cultures, histories, and interests, before you actually go to vote, in order that after the election there will be a clearer result rather than a dozen different pieces all trying to fit together. I am not a prophet. I don't know which of these or other solutions may come up. At the moment, if I were a betting man, which I'm not, I would be placing my bet on another election. But Israel continues to surprise us with how it deals with its own issues of democracy, representation, and its future. And this is something that, while it can seem chaotic and unstable, perhaps even disheartening, should instead remind us that this new Jewish state, since 1948, has always been a place of novelty, always been a place of change, and always been a place of hope. Do not despair that there is too much democracy. Give thanks that Israel has so much democracy that I seem to never be able to run out of sermon topics about it. Shabbat Shalom. someday I'll be able to get up here and say, the situation in Israel is the same as it was last month.